Today, though, we're really pleased to have two distinguished speakers from UC Berkeley. First, Karen Chappell, who is a professor and chair of city and regional planning at Berkeley. Karen was also the inaugural Bacon Public Lecturer here at UC Center Sacramento. That's a competitive award in which professors from all over the UC system competed to develop a policy research project, and Karen's was to relate urban planning to climate change, for those of you who were here back then. She is the Carmel P. Friesen Chair in Urban Studies, the author of many books, including one co-authored with another UCCS lecturer from several months back, Anastasia Lucato-Sideris. And she's a member of our faculty council, so provides ongoing advice to center's activities and planning. Finally, she mentioned in her conversation with the students earlier that she has, in the course of her career, mentored directly over 1,000 UC Berkeley students who are now placed in urban planning and other like positions throughout the state. So talk about ongoing impact. She'll be joined by Evan White, who brings an equally distinguished and interesting career. He's the founding executive director of the California Policy Lab, which is really the focus of today's presentation. Prior to that, he was senior advisor to Richard Cordray, who is the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And you may recognize that bureau as being founded by a name that's been prominent in the news lately, Elizabeth Warren. Evan has both a JD and a Master of Public Policy from UC Berkeley. He's had a number of other interesting and important positions with the California Supreme Court, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and even the White House, I presume the last White House, not this one. We're very pleased to welcome both of them today to talk to us about the California Policy Lab and what it's doing to advance policymaking in California. So we'll start with Karen Chappell.
Okay, thank you so much, Rich, for having me back, and great to see you all here. We have gathered here today to talk about big data, data science, and the University of California system, and also policymaking at the state level. My part of this talk will be to sort of give you the 101 of data science, because I know for a lot of us it's like, huh? What are you talking about? So I'll sort of introduce you to some concepts so we can understand better what we might be looking for. And then Evan will follow up with a use case of a wonderful partnership between the UC system and government agencies to use their data. This is actually part of a series, right, for UCCS this year, and you'll have Dean Henry Brady from our Goldman School of Public Policy will be here later this year. So the first question in our Intro 101 course is, what is big data and what is analytics? So how we differentiate big data is we typically say that this is data that is found rather than designed. So a lot of the data that social scientists have used for many years is collected via subjective process. And a lot of the data that we're using now instead is not deliberately collected by humans, but rather kind of a residual of other processes. So let me give you an example. We have, for instance, sensor data collecting data on where we move throughout our cities and regions, and that sensor data is now used to plan transportation systems rather than surveying you about how you travel to work. other examples are data that's when you fill out a form, when you go do a housing permit at the permit desk, that data gets recorded. There's sort of a data exhaust trail. So it's not just about that permit data, but also when you filed it and your background and so forth. So there's all this kind of residual data that we can use. And I'll be talking about a couple other examples of that. Big data comes at unprecedented volumes. It comes at high velocity. It often is in real time, which kind of changes how we do policymaking. We're not using old stale data from the census data from 2010, right? We're using data from yesterday. So that opens up a whole new potential. And we have data that is analyzed in a different way. It's analyzed by algorithms often. So in a traditional kind of policy evaluation framework or social science framework, we use a regression model where we kind of pick and choose what variables we're gonna test, and if we have collinearity, we maybe favor this variable over that variable. Machine learning takes that away by using algorithms that do the selection for us. So take the human out of the picture. Now the data science and analytics is actually much more common right now in the private sector than in the public sector. And you can just imagine why that's so. There's much lower barriers to changing your data systems in the private sector. You don't have the ethical issues that we have as public servants. You don't have the same cost issues. You don't have the same bureaucracy issues. Private sector also has better human capital. It has better infrastructure than we do, particularly in the state government and local governments in California. Yet, having the private sector do this work for the public sector has risks. And this is something that my colleagues in the information school at Berkeley, Deirdre Mulligan, writes about this a lot. She's looking right now at state contracting out to private vendors to do their data work and the ethical concerns it raises. It's often not accountable. There's no real often the private contractors don't pay much attention to how they've stored the data. There's issues of sustainability over time. There's ethical issues, equity issues as well, because the private sector might be guided more by efficiency concerns than equity concerns in how it analyzes the data. So we really, really need to build capacity, I argue, in the public sector. I'm going to talk for the rest of this time about what data science applications in the public sector might look like ideally, and then also how the UC system can support California government with data science. In preparation for this talk, we took a look at the open data systems that we have in the state of California. You have a wonderful data site, data.ca.gov, where you have your open data. What was interesting to us is analyzing who's actually posted data on this website. It was really about health and environmental concerns, some financial data sets, but not really that. Not much variety. For instance, in my field, I'm a planner, so I look for transportation and housing data. There's not that much up here. If you look across the state and you look at where the open data portals are around the state, you see that actually there's some deficits. So the purple here are the cities with open data portals. The green are the ones without. Where are the green places? Most of the Central Valley doesn't have open data portals. We found that just 17% of California cities have open data portals. So it's very uneven landscape, and this is a concern. Open data, having the data out there, is allowing people to analyze it and come up with different and potentially innovative solutions for our problems in the city and state of California. And so this is not having access to this data is just compounding the problem, or not releasing the innovation that we'd like to see. Now, that said, we can point to several different places that are doing really interesting work with data. Often they're using proprietary tools like ArcGIS and Tableau. These are actually expensive, so many cities have turned to JavaScript, which is open source. Instead, here's an example in the city of San Francisco of an analysis of transportation network companies that the County Transportation Authority did. It scraped this data, and then it looked at where Uber and Lyft were concentrating their activities in the city, and created this tool to be able to track that. You also have a number of different GIS portals. This is one from the state Department of Water Resources, where you can visualize county land use and really figure out how you're going to comply with the groundwater sustainability plan using this. So what is machine learning? So we see this used a lot in the private sector and in research, not so much in state government. So it's sort of an umbrella term for processes that derive information from large data sets using statistical modeling, really not that different from traditional regression, but again, just in a more systematic way. So what you do is you typically train your data on you train your models on existing data, and then you're able to predict in future values. And so these techniques are used primarily for prediction and classification. Let me give you some examples and try and bring this more to life. So in real estate markets, we see machine learning used to develop clusters to analyze things like housing price changes. So why do we need to do this? Well, so most of our data is coming down to us in administrative boundaries like census tracts, which have really no meaning in terms of from a policy perspective. They're just somebody drew a line around them. A machine learning approach here is going to allow you to identify clusters based on addresses and go over boundaries where you need to. Another example is this article that predicted sudden oat death in California. One of the problems with kind of predicting where diseases are going to appear is you only know what happened before. It's hard to know what's going to happen in the future, and so some of these models are trying to figure out in those what are the characteristics in these areas so that you can predict where it's going to happen in the future. Another example is this article on predicting arsenic in drinking water wells. Again, it was able to do some predict these concentrations by bringing in a variety of variables that the traditional models were not able to do. And then there's also use of these types of techniques in predicting precipitation and looking over a long period of time where rain patterns are going to happen. Now, data science is not just about these models, it's also about what we call citizen science. So it's about collecting data from people like us. And so I've already mentioned sensors, and they're sort of how we're being tracked by our cell phones everywhere. But there's also a deliberate effort to collect data from people on the ground and to have platforms that allow people to help formulate research questions, collect data, and analyze problems. So here's an example from SafeTrack at Berkeley, which is crowdsourcing data on traffic accidents and getting people to describe them in a way that the police reports, for instance, don't actually tell us. API, this is a term you may have heard and kind of wondered what it is when your kids talk about it. Oh, I got into the API, and you're like, what? Application Programming Interface. So this is a way that you can design apps or use your browser to send ongoing requests to another server where there's data, and you can have that data. You can collect that data on an ongoing basis based on instructions from that server. Again, this is something that is very commonly done in the private sector. You have, Google has its API. You can do this with many different apps in the private sector. We haven't really gotten to the point where we could do this with public sector data, state of California data, but wouldn't it be amazing, if we collected data on an ongoing basis and allowed developers access to it so they could innovate policy solutions? Let me give you an example of this from my own work. I do a lot of work on housing. So some of you, if anybody here works at state government, you may know that now we're collecting housing permit data in this housing element report. This is the annual element progress report. This is a nightmare Excel spreadsheet. I get so excited about this though, because we finally have data. This is started, can you believe it? We didn't collect this data in California until now, systematically across the whole state. Now we have it. It might be dirty, it might need some work, but we have it. And so this, to me, opens up all kinds of possibilities. So, for instance, why don't we take these permits and why don't we use machine learning to look at different patterns in permitting that are occurring across cities, and link it, for instance, to analysis of fiscal impact or greenhouse gas emissions. We could then link it to big data on say, traffic, and then look at whether our CEQA mitigation was appropriate or not. We could actually have an API that would do real-time permitting, would scrape data right after the person puts in their building permit. Why don't we collect that data so then we know, what's going on immediately, so we can start figuring out how to plan better. And then in terms of citizen science, half of the housing units in some of the parts of the state are not permitted. What if we actually had folks reporting data on housing that is not legally permitted, and then we could maybe help people bring it up to code and legalize it and so forth. So there's all sorts of potential here. We actually are launching a data science for housing course at UC Berkeley, funded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and where we're going to train government workers in how to use their own data. So we're really looking forward to that. In California, going back to the state, there's a lot of things that could be done here. I always follow the work in New York City that if you want to look at an organized effort on data and data science, you look at the New York City Open Data Portal, and they have a strategic plan. We should develop a strategic framework like that. We should have data plans really for all of our agencies, for all of our cities. We need to build the infrastructure then, and it needs to be an open source infrastructure then, so we can all share this data and join it more efficiently. Another thing we're doing at the state level is training folks. So if anybody know what this picture is, anybody been to Cal? Anybody been to Zellerbach Hall in Cal? Okay, Zellerbach Hall is where this class is held. What is it? It's called Data 8, and it is the Foundations of Data Science class. Data8.org, you can do it online, by the way, and there's an edX version of it too. But it's been adopted all over the world, and its home is here in Zellerbach, and we have to use Zellerbach because there's 1,500 students a semester taking this class, and we're at a point where half of our student body at Cal has taken this class. Foundations of Data Science is becoming a core of everybody's education. We have 800 data science majors at Cal, and it's become one of the top 5 majors. People are coming a lot from stats and computer science, but also from economics and social sciences. And one of the things that we're learning is a way to build a more diverse STEM workforce, because often the people that are terrified of computer science love the applied nature of data science. So it's growing super fast, and it's also at, by the way, San Diego and Irvine also have data science programs, and others are working on it as well in the UC system. So we're producing these students. You guys in Sacramento need to hire them, and they're going to transform how we do business in the state. Great. And now to talk about one last thing that the state could do, Evan will come talk about partnerships between the UC system and the state. Thank you.
All right, I'm actually going to switch over here. All right. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the invitation, UCCS folks. It's an honor to be here. My name is Evan White. I'm the executive director of the California Policy Lab. We're a new initiative started about 3 years ago. Initially at UC Berkeley and UCLA, but we're slowly branching out to other campuses around the UC system. Since it's the day before Halloween, I figured I would start with some data science humor. Well, if you get it, you get it. So just to transition from what Sharon was talking about, as she said, I'm going to talk a little bit about one use case of how UC is bringing the power of data science to state government here, and that's the California Policy Lab. The differences, I think, from some of the examples that she was using is that many of those were based on open data, right? The data that you can make available on an open data portal has certain qualities to it. It has to be sort of data that you would be able to give to the government without, or to the public without any privacy concerns. Most of the work that the California Policy Lab does is on what I would call closed data, right? So it's data that sort of by design is very sensitive in nature. It's difficult to work with. And so you'll see my examples. They very much focus on what I'll call administrative data, which is data that's collected by the government as part of their normal processes. It's usually at the individual level. And we're using that to inform governments about how they're delivering services and how they can improve their policies and programs. The other thing that sort of flows from that is that a lot of the examples that Karen was talking through relate to the provision of public goods, which is one thing we count on our governments to do, things like transportation, housing, environment, things like that. A lot of our work at the Policy Lab actually focuses on the delivery of individual services, right? So the delivery of human services, criminal justice, education. These are ways in which you interact with government on sort of an individual basis. Let me talk a little bit about the problem that I think the California Policy Lab is designed to solve. So this is what I sort of view as the status quo, and I say this as someone who's worked in government for about a dozen years before I came to this role. California government has a lot of pressing policy problems, many of the ones that Karen was talking about, that need analyzing, and they need it desperately. But each sort of, if you're working in an executive level agency, you've experienced this, your data is siloed, you can only sort of see the one set of variables that exist at your agency. And it's often difficult to confront a problem like homelessness, which is so multifaceted, when you're just looking at one sort of aspect of the problem. The other thing is that government has had some troubles attracting high-quality researchers. Certainly that's not always the case, but I think anyone who's worked in government recruiting knows that it's very hard to get folks to come and work in the government, and when they attract researchers, those researchers are often put onto sort of mandatory reporting that needs to be done by any given government agency, and don't get the opportunity to sort of do the learning part of the research process. Certainly that's not always the case, but it's sometimes the case. And then lastly, and I'll say this because I work with academics, they can be clueless, right? Like the stereotype we have of academics is often ones that are very detached from reality, up in the ivory tower. They are often out of touch and can be slow to respond. It might take 3 years to complete a study that an academic is quite proud of. They put it in a journal, and it's completely irrelevant to the policy process, which happens on budgetary cycles. It happens on a 6-month, yearly basis, things like that. UC researchers, on the other hand, we sort of have a lot of expertise within the UC system, a ton of expertise. Many of those folks do want to do applied projects, but they're not very good at navigating government systems. The whole process of becoming an academic is one that's individualistic and is often sort of not about navigating large bureaucracies, which is what it's like to work in government. So we try and bridge the gap that I've described here. So the California Policy Lab, what we try and do is improve the lives of Californians by generating evidence that transforms public policy. We try and create lasting research partnerships between agencies within state and local government in California, on the one hand, and academics within the UC system, and even sometimes outside the UC system on the other hand. Most of our projects are trying to unlock the power of administrative data that the government's already collecting to try and bridge across those data silos I was talking about earlier. So we work in these areas that are here on the right: education, labor and employment, social safety net, criminal justice, health, and homelessness. Much of our work is by nature cross-disciplinary, so we really are trying to sort of see multiple different sides of the Rubik's Cube, if that makes sense. So I'll give you a couple examples in a minute. This is a visual that tries to describe part of what we're doing here, which is to create a platform through which governments can link up with researchers within the UC system, make it easy for both sides to do that type of work. There's a lot of sort of data infrastructure. There's a lot of legal pieces to this and privacy laws that are really important, but as an academic, you're not really trained to understand those things. By creating an infrastructure for doing that, we're sort of passing forward all of the value that's created with each new partnership to future partnerships that come down the line. So I'll describe a little bit about that in a second. Here are some of the current partners. We're about 3 years old, as I said, so if your agency's not on here, just give us some time. But we work with a number of state-level partners, the Tax Board, the Department of Social Services, the Employment Development Department. We work with the Student Aid Commission and the community colleges and the UC system. And we've also done some projects with DOJ and CDCR on criminal justice. Likewise, and we have almost probably stronger partnerships with a lot of different local systems around the country, especially in Los Angeles, Sonoma County, and San Francisco, which just happen to be the places that we began. We have partnerships with criminal justice agencies like police departments and sheriff's departments, with county CEOs, with health departments, with homelessness agencies. And so a lot of policy, as you guys probably know, happens at the county level. And so if you don't have partnerships at both the state and the county level, you really can't tackle some of the problems like homelessness or like criminal justice that happen in sort of both of those places simultaneously. This is a bit of a description about how we're trying to change the research life cycle. I won't spend too much time on this, but suffice it to say that the sort of status quo is that often it takes about 1 to 2 years to set up an initial project, to get it going, to get data use agreements in place. Often the research questions are developed exclusively by the researcher. And when the project is over, and after they've done all that work cleaning the data and getting it sort of ready to analyze, everything's destroyed after that, right? So the data use agreement goes away, the data that's been sort of cleaned goes away, the code that creates those clean data goes away. And as I've mentioned before, often the policymaker is left with something that is sort of out of date and not applicable to what they're working on. What we've tried to do is create a situation where those research questions are jointly developed. So we have, with all those partners, we have ongoing research agendas where we update. We often have bi-weekly meetings with those partners and try and develop a sort of forthcoming research agenda, what's on their policy agenda, who can we find on the UC side who would help them address those questions. We have existing data use agreements in place, and often we have the data already being worked on by some other professor on our system, and so it's very easy for us to get approvals in place for a new project to use that data. And sometimes a process that used to take 2 years can now take 2 weeks, and what that means is that we can get much more timely evidence to policymakers and can change policy. Here's a couple sort of by the numbers of what we've done thus far, number of data use agreements in place and projects going. All I would say is that we've been in operation for about 3 years, and so I'm proud that the numbers are this big, but they really are sort of skyrocketing over the past 12 months. I'm going to go through a couple examples of our work just to give you the texture of it. So this is a project that we did in San Francisco where they were piloting a new project, a new sort of team to provide early representation to people in the criminal justice system. So most times, if you're indigent, a poor criminal defendant, you get representation, but only after arraignment, which is the process where you go before a judge and they determine whether or not you're released pretrial. Now, obviously, being released pretrial or being held pretrial is a pretty big decision and can affect your case outcomes, can also affect your life because you might lose your job, you might have to figure out childcare while you're being detained. So they experimented with providing early representation before arraignment, immediately upon arrest, like you would get if you were a defendant who had the means to provide your own attorney. What we found was actually quite shocking, and I don't know that we expected to find this, but what we found is that the rate of release for those defendants who were provided early representation actually doubled with the provision of these services. And what that meant was that not only did the mayor immediately sort of re-up funding for that program, but what we've had is outreach from a lot of different public defenders around the country who are now starting up this a similar program. And we're doing another project is in the beginning stages in another county here in California. We're actually going to try and randomize the provision of this intervention because they don't have enough funding to provide it to everyone, to provide even sort of more rigorous evidence on this particular topic. Another example here, we're working in Los Angeles on a project to try and prevent homelessness upstream. So you guys are probably familiar. Los Angeles has the state's biggest homelessness crisis, about 60,000 folks who are living on the streets there. While a big portion of the problem is certainly trying to fix the homelessness crisis and get those folks who don't have homes into housing, another part of it is about preventing that problem before it starts, right? Trying to stem the tide. Now, when you think about homelessness prevention, one of the complications of it is that it's really hard to target prevention programs, right? You don't know who's going to become homeless in the coming year. And that becomes a real problem when you're trying to sort of figure out how to target services. And so what we did was work with the county to take a look at the information that they were already, so the services that they were already providing to folks, and see if we could predict who would become homeless in the coming year. What were the risk factors that were involved with that? And could we do a better job of targeting those prevention services to see which ones were working and which ones didn't work? And so this project, we actually recently put up a version of this on our website, is being used by the county to now roll out some new prevention services and sort of test out whether or not those prevention services work. I'll give another example here. This was one of the first projects that we did together with the Corrections and Rehabilitation Department. So there was a $15 million program that was designed to prevent drug and other contraband from entering into the state's prisons. And they had developed sort of a moderate version of this and a very strict version of the intervention. It mostly involves sort of new ion scanners and different sort of canine presence within the prisons that they tried it out on. And what we found was that the sort of moderate version where they increased efforts to try and prevent contraband didn't really move the needle in terms of preventing contraband in the prisons, as measured by the number of people who had positive drug tests. But the more strict version did. And so we were able to sort of test both of those out, see whether or not which intervention had a bigger impact on the contraband in the prisons. And then the governor ended up making a change as a result of that study. So actually sort of moved money around, millions of dollars in the state budget as a result of that evaluation. Another project that we did was with the Student Aid Commission. So the Cal Grant, as you may know, is a college scholarship that's offered, generally speaking, to folks to high schoolers who are high achieving and low income. But there are a number of folks who don't take up the scholarship for one reason or another. And the Student Aid Commission thought that there might be, that the outreach that they were doing to those students wasn't quite good enough. And so we got a behavioral scientist who we work with on the case. We redesigned the outreach program and specifically sort of put in efforts to try and clarify the letters, clarify the language, and emphasize to students that they belonged in college, and sort of, putting in language there that was really like, you belong, you deserve this, follow these steps to sign up. And what we found was that about 14% more students, high school students, took the first step to taking up the Cal Grant. We're actually still waiting for the results of sort of who actually enrolled in college, so we'll figure that out at some point. But what you're seeing here on the left is the blue lines are the folks who got the new revised letters, and the black line is the folks who got the old letter. So there was quite a big jump in registrations for the Cal Grant. We're now working with the Student Aid Commission. They made an immediate change to update their letters to the new versions. And now we're working with them on something that is, I think, really interesting, which is we've used the information that people put on their FAFSAs about where they want to go to college as a way of giving them back information about the net price of going to each of those colleges. So as you may know, under the Obama administration, each college is required to put a net price calculator on their website. So we take the FAFSA information, we put it into that net price calculator, we pull down the number, and then we put on the letter a comparison of the net price of attending each of those colleges that the student might be interested in. Was that great? Thanks. So this is sort of a mock-up of it on the right. This is not exactly what it looked like when we designed it. But what a lot of students might be surprised to learn is that if you get a Cal Grant, attending a UC or a CSU, four-year college, is often just as cheap as attending a community college. And so we're sort of going to measure whether or not this encouraged more folks to go into four-year colleges, and also whether it encouraged more folks to take up the Cal Grant. I'll give you just one more example. I know I'm hitting you fast and hard with all these. This is a project that we did focused on UC Berkeley, which made a change in its admissions policies recently. It started accepting letters of recommendation for the first time. So in most selective colleges around the country, you submit letters of recommendation. UCs, for a long time, nobody ever submitted any letters of recommendation. And UC Berkeley just recently made a change to start soliciting letters of recommendation from sort of what you might think of as the folks who are right on the margin. There's the folks who are always going to get into UC Berkeley. There's the folks who are never going to get into UC Berkeley. And that middle sort of 50% of folks they solicited, and 50% is not quite the right number, but the middle set of folks were solicited to provide a letter of recommendation. And there was a lot of question about whether or not this would, what sort of effects this would have on diversity of the incoming class, right? You could imagine, on the one hand, that letters could, for underrepresented students at UC Berkeley, could provide them with an opportunity to show the sort of obstacles that they've overcome in obtaining, in sort of getting to where they've gotten. You could also imagine that they might have a more difficult time in finding a good letter writer. And so there was a real question about what the impacts would be on diversity. And what we found was that on net, they actually helped members of underrepresented groups and enabled more of them to get into Berkeley. And so just after that study was released, the system decided to allow all of the colleges to solicit letters of recommendation. Turns out none of them want to do it except for UC Berkeley, but we'll see. You never know over time. These are some other examples of our work. We're working on issues from cash bail reform. We'll have a study on that coming out soon, sort of regional variations in community college outcomes. We're doing a study that links up data on employment with data about homeless individuals in Los Angeles to study the employment trends both before homelessness and during homelessness. We're doing a study that looks at the gig economy and the use of online demand platforms like Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, and so forth to try and provide a better picture of what's happening in California with the use of those services and how people are using them to sort of weather job loss and other things like that. We're doing a set of studies looking at the earned income tax credit and trying to encourage more people to take up the earned income tax credit. We'll have results on that coming out this fall. And there's a couple of other examples here that I won't go into. So I think that's it. I think we'll sit up here and take your questions. Thank you for listening.